Thank you, Norma. Thank you to the Mann family. Thank you to the synagogue, and thank you all for coming out on a rainy Sunday morning. Uh, Anti-Semitism. When I preached you this lecture, it was well before October 7th. And some of you probably really want to know what's going on right now and what has changed since October 7th. And I'm really not going to be able to address that. One of the things I talked about a moment ago is upstairs is how long and how difficult it is to do good quality surveys, and they can't be done instantly. And we just really, I'm not going to be able to talk about how American public opinion has changed since October 7th, or Israeli public opinion. And I would advise you to be a little bit skeptical about surveys that you read that are trying to get instant reads on these kinds of things. It's hard. And anti-Semitism is a hard topic to ask people about. I'll get into that. In fact, some of you may well feel that anti-Semitism is something that has always existed, and maybe is always gonna exist. Maybe it goes up and down, but it's irrational, and maybe at some level you may think to yourselves, what is there to study there? I mean, it's a craziness, and there's no justifying it. It isn't based on what Jews do, and so kind of like, why should we even bother trying to think about it this way? And I understand that. I really do. I share that view in some ways. But I put that aside because as a social scientist, we do try to figure things out. I will tell you at the Pew Research Center, one thing we're not trying to do is move public opinion in a particular direction or move policy. So we're not a policy shop. We are not a think tank in a classic way. We have no clients, no advertisers. We can't commission the Pew Research Center full for any amount of money. We're funded by the Pew Charitable Trust. Pew is a family name. It's old oil money. They own Sunoco, Sun Oil in Pennsylvania. Put billions of dollars into trusts, and those trusts pay for our work, among other things. I wish we had all the billions, but we get a substantial amount of money. We do have some other large foundations that help us. But we're not a policy shop. We don't take policy positions. We don't make recommendations. And one of the reasons is, if you're trying to move public opinion and trying to measure public opinion, the measurement is going to be distrusted, and maybe should be distrusted. And maybe, whether you intend to or not, your desire to move policy in a particular way could affect how you measure what's going on. So, as both an internal and an external check, we don't do that. We never take policy positions. And if some of you say to me, Alan, what should we do about anti-Semitism? I'm just going to turn the question around to you. I'll give you what facts I can. I'm not going to pretend that they're the most important ones necessarily or the best. I'm going to try to be honest with you, and we can engage in some conversation about what we know and a lot that we don't know. But I'm not here to tell you what is to be done. Pew Research Center doesn't do that in general. I will say a couple of quick words about myself, just so you know, and also my way of honesty. I'm not a doctor. I don't have a PhD. I'm a former journalist. I was a reporter and editor for 27 years, starting in a small newspaper, the Berkshire Eagle in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And you know Pittsfield, the Berkshire Eagle? Yep, started out there. Right at the day after I graduated from college, I started at the Berkshire Eagle. I actually worked there during college as well. Then I joined the AP, the Associated Press, and I was in Moscow as a correspondent, covered the fall of the Soviet Union, Cold Wars, coups, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, all that kind of stuff. I wrote feature stories too. Then I worked for a magazine called U.S. News and World Report. I was based in Moscow for 6 years for the AP and for U.S. News, and then for a couple of years I was in the Middle East, based in Jerusalem, lived in Jerusalem with my wife, and covered the whole Middle East. And then came back, and I was foreign editor for a while. And then I went to the Washington Post. And for 10 years, I was the reporter editor of the Washington Post. And then when I left the Washington Post, I went to the Pew Research Center, which was just around the block, basically, a place that I had admired and whose data I had used when I was at the Post. So I've been at the Pew Research Center for almost 15 years now. It's like a second career. I feel very lucky to have this second career. And while I don't have a PhD in sociology, basically I work as a sociologist. and I work with a cadre of highly academically trained and extremely professional, world-class demographers, sociologists, political scientists, and statisticians, and we do our work. Jews are just one part of what we study. We study religion. My group studies religion in the United States and around the world. Part of that is Jews. Part of that is anti-Semitism, but it's not. I just want you to know that's not my central focus, though in the last few years it has become increasingly a subject that people are interested in. I'm personally interested in it, so I focus somewhat. Now, we think about anti-Semitism, and again, my bias in a sense is I'm a measurement person. Have you ever heard of a guy named Heike Otis? He was a great Dutch chemist, one of the greatest chemists of all time. And above his laboratory, he had in Dutch the words, and I've written them on sort of, I don't have a thing over my door, but if I did, it would have his words in Dutch. Tot meten door wetten, from measurement to knowledge. And it's based on all science, right? Repeated measurement is what gives us knowledge. And it's the same thing. We're trying to measure things. Now we think about anti-Semitism, what we could measure. Just very quickly, you could come up with a whole lot of different things you would want to measure. And I just want you to think about this for a second, because I'm only able to measure, and really only going to talk about today, one or two aspects of all the things potentially we could measure. Potentially. And this is, I'm sure, not a full list, but just to think about it for a second. I'm going to talk some about what people say they think, and say they do, and say they experience. That's expressive, that's probably. It's not necessarily what they internally really think, or what they really do, but it's what they say, which is important. That's one thing we can measure. But to me, if I were starting and wanted to know about anti-Semitism, maybe the first thing I'd want to know about is not that. Maybe something more important is what people do. Not what they say they do, not what they say they think, but what do they do? And in particular, I'd like to know how many incidents of anti-Semitism there are, and I'd also like to know how severe they are, right? And where they are, and who does them, and information about that. And some of that's also available. Pew Research Center doesn't really collect that, but I'm going to share some of that. And when you think about it too, there's another few elements of it that may be even more important. Well, when those things happen, how does the government respond? What does the government do? Does the government investigate? Does the government prosecute? Do government officials condemn? That's really, really important. If you think back through history, that's been super important. Also, what about not just the government, what about civic societies? How do institutions react? How do universities? What statements do university presidents make? What do clergy say? Not just Jewish, but other. What do businesses do, etc. Then we might also think about more deeply, could you measure, and there are ways scientists, social scientists have come up with, psychologists and others, trying to measure what people actually think, trying to measure their implicit, very sort of brainwavy things, and also asking people to answer questions super quickly, so quickly they can't sort of consciously think. It's called implicit bias tests. And then there's a whole other realm, right? Social media is very big these days. You could measure what people are saying and doing on social media if you have that. So these are just a few of the various things one potentially could measure. And though I'm going to talk mostly about this, I am not claiming this is the most important. Okay? Let's start actually with number 2. Let's start with, it's a little bit awkward that I have to do this way, but I hope it's okay. I hope you all can see, and can you hear in the back? Okay. So, let's just start with some measures of what has been happening. And this first chart is not Pew Research Center data. This is data from ADL, used to be called the Anti-Defamation League. I don't know if you know, but Anti-Defamation League just now uses the initials. They rebranded as just ADL. This is just the last 4 years. This is the U.S. And ADL tracks this data, but it's not actually their data because they're not a law enforcement agency, but they gather this data from around the country. And the blue is incidents of harassment. The green is vandalism, which is sort of higher level, actually like physical damage, etc. And the red is assault, sort of the highest level. So it is on a spectrum of severity. And in 2019, there were 61 cases of assault. In 2020, 33. So in a sense, small numbers went down, and then up to 88 in 2021, and then up to 111 in 2022. And altogether, the ADL's tracking shows 3,000, this all adds up to 3,697 anti-Semitic incidents that they tracked in 2022. 2023 data is not yet available, and that was a 36% increase from 2021, and the highest number that ADL has since they began this tracking in 1979. So if you believe this data, and I have no reason not to believe it, but again, it's not my data, but incidents seem to be rising, and I leave it to your discretion to think about whether severity is rising. I would say severity is sort of bumping around. It's not clear to me that every year there's been an increase in the number of the most severe incidents. But of course, many of us are aware of things like the shootings in Pittsburgh and Poway, California, et cetera, and it does feels at least like the severity has also increased. Now, those are absolute numbers. Let's think about this in percentage terms. So this is a chart, not from the ADL, but from the FBI. Again, it's only through 2022. The 2023 data is not yet available. The FBI shows that the number of hate crimes of all sorts, biased, motivated crimes, reported in the United States has been rising pretty steadily year by year, and is now roughly double in 2022 what it was in 2013. So the overall number of hate crimes has also been rising. So yes, anti-Semitic incidents are rising, but also overall hate crimes, of which anti-Semitic are a part, have been rising. So if we look at this in percentage terms, it is a slightly different picture. So this is a graph, and I'm sorry it's maybe hard for you to see this if you're in the back, so I'll sort of talk about it for a moment. But this is showing in percentage terms of all the hate crimes, who are the targets, who was targeted in the hate crimes across the United States by year from 2013 through 2022. And you'll notice actually that the largest share of all the hate crimes were against Black Americans. Second largest share of all hate crimes were against LGBTQ plus Americans. You'll notice that by religion, of religious groups targeted in hate crimes, Jews were the most targeted religious group in the United States, followed by Muslims and then Catholics. Now again, there are other religious groups, Sikhs and so on, that are also targeted hate crimes, but their numbers are not shown here, and they're lower. And you'll also notice that as a share of all hate crimes, interesting things happen as a percentage. So this moment represents the George Floyd moment, and in the aftermath of George Floyd, the number of anti-Black, Black Lives Matter, the anti-Black bias acts rose dramatically, and partly as a consequence of that, because those rose as a share of all. The Jewish numbers actually fell that year, and has since been rising. So the percentage figures look rather different from the absolute number figures. And I think, I'm not trying to tell you what's right or wrong. I respect your intelligence, but I think it's useful to know that while numbers of anti-Semitic incidents have been rising, overall hate crimes have been rising, and it isn't clear that as a percentage of all crimes, anti-Semitic incidents have been rising. Is that clear what I'm trying to get across there? Again, and I'm not poo-pooing anything. I'm just trying to show you the data and let you see it, and you make your own judgments. Now, Well, I said 2023 data for the whole year is not available. I pulled this off the New York Police Department's hate crimes dashboard, and they don't have data up for the last 3 months, so I don't have post-October 7th data, and things may have changed. They've gotten worse, I don't know. But for the first 9 months of 2023 in New York City, this is what they call word cloud. You're all familiar with a word cloud? Where the size of the words is proportional to the number of incidents against each group. So those were national figures, but things can look quite different regionally. So in New York City, Jews were far and away the leading target of bias crimes, hate crimes. These are also, by the way, what the New York City Police Department calls confirmed incidents. So not just allegations, and maybe not prosecuted or convicted, but at least they confirmed that a bias crime happened in their opinion. And you'll see, so just to give you what this represents in absolute numbers, New York City had 375 confirmed incidents in the first 9 months of 2023, including 155 against Jews. The second biggest group was Asians. Oh, sorry. The second biggest group was against gays. Using their language, they've got male, homosexual, gay, as police department talk, but against gay Americans, 65%, and 37% against Asians. Not percent, but 65 incidents, and 35 incidents against Asians. 155 against Jews, just by comparison. So, national level, local level, percentage, absolute number, different pictures depending on what you're looking at. All right. Now, so I started with number 2 level, which personally, to me, I think is more important. Any of you feel differently? Do you think public opinion is more important than the actual number of incidents? Nobody? You agree with me? Yeah.
I actually want to know how much public opinion see the numbers. Hate crimes as a
So yes, so that's what I'm going to talk about. That's what I'm going to talk about. We're getting there. So public opinion. So let's see what we can see about public opinion. All right. Now, asking people, if I call you up, or I send you a letter, or I try to survey your opinion one way or another, maybe I interview you face to face, and I start asking you questions like, what do you think about black people? How do you feel about gay people? How do you feel about Italians? How do you feel about Catholics? How do you feel about Jews? Those are uncomfortable questions, even a little bit weird questions, right? And to be honest, they're very hard questions to ask in surveys. We get a lot of what's called item non-response on surveys on these questions. Item non-response is not that people don't take the survey, but they don't like that question and they skip that question. So how do we do it? Well, there's been a variety of ways we've tried to do it over time. And one is a little bit hokey thing. It's called a feeling thermometer. And I don't know why it works, but I can just tell you, practical matter, it works. We say, imagine a thermometer of your feelings, where 0 is the coldest, most negative feeling, 50 is neutral, and 100 is the warmest, most positive feeling. Now, where on this feeling thermometer would you put Catholics? And where in the feeling thermometer would you put atheists? And where in this feeling thermometer would you put Jews? And I don't know why exactly, but it turns out that people are more willing to answer that question. And you get lower item non-response, and you get data that is meaningful in the sense that we can see it's consistent over time, it varies in logical ways, it makes sense. It's not just sort of random and weird. You can see this in its internal consistency over time. One of the patterns that we can see, this first time we did this in recent history, we did it in 2014. We asked this feeling thermometer, and of all the groups we asked about, all the religious groups, Jews overall got the highest rating. And that's particularly true when you analyze these data by looking only at how people rate groups other than their own. So some religious groups are much bigger than others. Jews are a small religious group. Catholics, for example, are a large religious group in the United States. About 1 in 5 Americans is Catholic. Evangelical Protestants, also a large religious group in the United States. About 1 in 4 Americans identifies in one way or another as an evangelical Protestant. So those groups, most groups rate their own group very warmly, positively. So if you just look at how they rate all groups, the bigger groups, the overall ratings will be affected by people rating their own group positively, and the little groups would not have that. So as a sort of corrective for that, one way of analyzing the data is just to look at how people rate every group other than their own. And that's what I'm showing you here. We could do it either way, but if you analyze it by how Americans rate groups other than their own, Jews are clearly the most positively rated, most warmly rated. And not only do Jews get the largest number of positive ratings, but interestingly, they get the smallest share of highly negative ratings, highly cold ratings. Now, that's 10% is not nothing, but it's a relatively low share compared with the other groups. So, for example, 40% of Americans rate atheists and Muslims as of 2014 very, very coldly, where Jews get these overall warm ratings. That was in 2014. We did the same thing in 2017, asked the question in a different way, using a somewhat different methodology, and the numbers come out different, but the pattern is the same. Jews, again, tied effectively in statistical tie. Those differences are not statistically significant. Tied with Catholics and mainline Protestants. Did it again in 2019, and again, Jews came out on top. Meanwhile, by the way, we're not the only ones who do this. Maybe you've heard of the political scientist at Harvard, Robert Putnam, who wrote the book Bowling Alone, wrote the book American Grace. Putnam's done a bunch of surveys like this, asking the same kind of question, different wording, different groups, whatever, same pattern. Others have done it too. This has been replicated many, many times. The polling continually finds overall Jews are as warmly rated or more warmly rated than any other religious group in the United States. Consistently, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, atheists, and Muslims rank lowest of religious groups, with the highest shares who rank them coldly. Now, some of our methodologists have worried a bit about the feeling thermometer. We do get a lot of people who just put 50 for all groups. And we're not really sure whether that's because they're truly just saying, I can't rate whole groups, which is a legitimate answer to the question, or whether they're just what we call satisfying. They're just taking the easiest way out of answering the question. Satisficing, not satisfying, satisficing. You can look it up. But it's like in polling, it would just be taking the easy way out of the question. So some of our methodologists are not super keen on the feeling thermometer. And we have tried doing this in other ways. And most recently, in the poll that Ella was talking about, is one that we did in 2022. We released the data in 2023. And instead of the feeling thermometer, we simply asked people how favorable their views are of various religious groups. Very favorable, somewhat favorable, not too favorable, and not at all favorable. And we also explicitly gave people an option to say that they don't know, or neither, or they don't want to answer the question. And a lot of people pick that answer. In fact, in most cases, it's a majority of people who opt out of the question. Okay? And so I don't know what those people think. But among those who express, okay, again, this is expressed public opinion. It's not necessarily what people feel deep down in their souls, but what they tell us, which is important. You get the highest ratio of very favorable or somewhat favorable to very or somewhat unfavorable for Jews. So 35% give Jews a very favorable or somewhat favorable rating, 6% a very or somewhat unfavorable rating. And that is a higher positive ratio towards Jews than for any other of the religious groups we asked about. And again, consistently, the most negative views are atheists, Muslims, and Mormons. Now, one of the things to realize about polling is we'll have something we call a marginal result. So I'll ask a polling question and we get 35% say this, 42% say that, and a certain number of the answer. Those marginal results, they depend hugely on how we ask the question, how we do the survey, whatever. In a certain sense, those marginal results are just actually not that important. But if you ask the same question repeatedly over time, using the same methods, the same context, the same kind of survey, the same methodology, then you're measuring a trend that should be valuable information, even if the marginal result is something you suspect may not be capturing the full picture. And what I'm trying to say to you here is, it's not that I want you to take away that 35% of Americans are faithful to Jews and 6% are not. It's that we've done these surveys and others have done these surveys repeatedly, using different methods over time. We keep finding the same patterns. The same patterns indicate that Jews are among the most favorably or the most favorably viewed by the public as a whole. So, what does this mean? So I've shown you on the one hand, anti-Semitic incidents are high, rising, at least in absolute numbers. In some parts of the country, like New York, Jews are the most targeted group. On the other hand, I've shown you that public opinion seems to say Jews are the most favorably regarded. So what the heck is going on? All right, well, what are our options? And I'm going to put just to a poll in a moment. You're going to tell me. So, number one option is maybe the incident tracking is right. There's all this widespread and growing anti-Semitism in America. And the polls are misleading. People don't want to admit it. They don't want to say, I don't like Jews. They know the right answer is to say Jews are fine. So maybe that's what's going on. Fair enough. Or you think, well, actually, you know what? I think about it. Most of the people I know, they're not anti-Jewish. They're neutral or maybe even kind of pro-Jewish. A lot of them. They think of Jews as good people. When Robert Putnam was asked, why do your surveys show Jews are the most favorably viewed religious group in America? Putnam's answer was, it's obvious. Because people think Jews are successful, smart, and funny. That's American. It's the Seinfeld effect. And I'm not just kidding. We do, in sociology, call it the Seinfeld effect. Jews are widely, if you look at dating sites, again, how people behave, not just what they say, you will see it's amazing. All this catfish. You know what catfish is on dating sites? In this, it's non-Jews pretending to be Jews because they want to meet Jewish men and women. They want to date and even marry them. Like this, I'm not denying anti-Semitism, but there is this other side of the coin. But Jews are actually very well thought of as a successful, smart, funny group in America, urban and urbane. So maybe that's right. Maybe the polls are right. And the incident tracking, the tracking, first of all, the FBI tracking, not all agencies report differently every year. There are allegations. Who knows what the real motives were? So maybe you say, okay, I trust the polls, and I'm not so sure about that incident tracking. Besides, those numbers in absolute terms don't seem that big. So that's another possibility. Right. Third possibility. Maybe they're both right. Maybe the incident tracking is capturing something. Now, most Americans are not anti-Semites, but how many does it take? How many does it take? And how many violent ones does it take to make life miserable and frightening? And maybe that's what's going on. Remember, those feeling thermometers, they still show 10% of people with very cold and expressive, not afraid, and say, no, I feel coldly toward Jews. I'm giving them a cold rating. 10%. Is it taking 10% to do that? Maybe it doesn't. So, let's do a quick poll. want to have hands. How many? Now, you may think, oh, so the way we do this is, which of these comes closest to your opinion, even if none of them is exactly right? How many of you go with number 1? How many of you go with number 2? How many of you go with number 3? Woo! Wow. Okay. Really interesting. I'm not here to sell you an answer. I don't know.
What do you think?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of validity. I mean, the polls, I see polling, I've worked with polling. This is the finding about Jews, I'm just trying to stress, it's not one Pew Research Center poll. It's a consistent finding, and ask it, and we do it different ways, we keep coming up with the same thing. At a certain point, you say, okay, there's something there. It's not the marginal result, but that pattern is. So I trust the polls in that sense. Again, I'm not saying the polls are actually capturing this is the percentage of Americans who are anti-Semitic. I can't tell you what percentage of Americans are anti-Semitic. And it also depends on what your definition is of anti-Semitic. So we're not going back to saying people, these are cross-sectional polls. The N varies. The favorability poll, that was many thousands. And this is our American Trends panel, so this is going to be like 10,000 people plus. The older ones were done by telephone, and so the sample sizes there are probably between 1,500 and 3,000. But none of these are jump polls, and none of them are small. We don't do jump polls, and we don't do small ends. So every end is going to be well over 1,000. And again, I didn't show you what Jews are saying, because I don't have a big enough N for Jews in any of those. This is what the general public is saying about Jews, not what Jews are saying about Jews, not what Muslims are saying about Jews. Again, I also wouldn't have a big enough sample size to talk about Muslims separate. What we know about the experiences and feelings of American Jews as they report them. This data is from our 2020 survey of American Jews, which was a very large, complex, difficult survey to undertake. But ultimately, we interviewed close to 70,000 people across the United States. We asked them a bunch of screening questions, and we identified from that initial group, which was stratified, so we did more initial interviewing in places where we believe more Jews live, and we ultimately identified more than 4,000 Jewish Americans and interviewed them for that study. It's available online, and our report is called Jewish Americans in 2020. You'll notice the cover of this printed version has the U.S. flag. It has one Jewish star. You know why that is? One Jewish star on the American flag? 2%. Statistically accurate representation of the size of the American Jewish community, which is roughly speaking 2% of the total. So in 2020, a few years ago, but this is already after the shootings in Pittsburgh and Tree of Life and Poway, we asked American Jews whether they thought that there was more anti-Semitism when they took the survey than there had been 5 years earlier, or less, or about the same. And 75%, even 75, said there's more. Very few, 5% said there was less. And about 1 in 5 said there's about the same amount. And then we asked a question, we said, do you, as an American Jew, feel less safe than you did 5 years ago? And there we get a very slender majority, 53%, saying they feel less safe. And very few who said they feel more safe. A considerable number who said they personally don't feel much change. So perceptions of anti-Semitism and feelings of insecurity are, at least retrospectively, by respondents, reported to be increasing. Now, among those who said they feel less safe, we tried, and I think that's a very difficult thing for polls to measure, we tried to get a sense of, okay, what difference does that make in your life? So the follow-up question we asked was, among those who said they feel less safe, have you hesitated to participate in any Jewish observances or celebrations or events because of that insecurity? And then did you ultimately participate or did you not? And this adds up to 53% because that's the share of those who feel less safe. So in other words, it's based on all Jews. So 35% of all the Jews in the survey said that they do feel less safe, but they haven't hesitated to participate in any events. 12% say they hesitated, but then they didn't participate. And 5% said they hesitated and they didn't participate. Again, I'm not going to say this is perfect data. It's not telling me actually what number of people participate, whatever, but at least retrospectively gives us a sense that many Americans feel anti-Semitism is rising, 75%. Half or more feel personally less safe. A much smaller proportion have actually tell us that they stopped doing things or didn't do something as a result. 5%. And I'm not claiming 5% is a small number or a big number. I don't have a position on whether that's a big number or a small number. It's 5% of all Jews. I'll leave that to you to think about. There was one other thing, and I don't have a slide on this, but I was thinking about this very interesting question we did. We asked the people who said anti-Semitism has risen, why? Why do you think anti-Semitism has risen? And we said, do you think it's because more people hold anti-Semitic views today? Or do you think it's because people with anti-Semitic views feel more free to express them today? Or both? Or neither? Okay, and you all are really good. It's like you guys should be on a game show. Because the vast majority said either number two or both. It was relatively small. I'm not going to use small enough. There was 5% who said it's because more people hold anti-Semitic views. Again, this is as of 2020. Things may have changed, perceptions may have changed, but as of 2020, I would say the plurality of Jews were saying it's because people with anti-Semitic views feel more free to express them. So something in the overall climate had changed. And it was an absolute majority who said both were involved. But either number two or both. All right, keeping on with this. Now, as a very intelligent woman in the first row pointed out, not all Jews are equal in a sense. Not all Jews are equally visible. And what we see in this survey when we ask about experiences, not perceptions, but experiences, have you personally seen anti-Jewish graffiti or vandalism? Have you personally been made to feel unwelcome because you are Jewish? That's what it said. Have you personally been called offensive names because you were Jewish? All these were in the last year, by the way. Have you personally been harassed online, or have you personally been physically threatened or attacked because you're Jewish? So again, a kind of gradation of severity, and I'll leave that up to your judgment. There could be cases clearly where harassment online could be worse than being made to feel unwelcome, or etc. But something like you'll see more at this end, and in this end, smaller numbers who say they've been physically threatened or attacked. But the consistent pattern is higher numbers or higher shares of Orthodox Jews who are reporting most of these kinds of incidents. And potentially there's multiple explanations for that. One explanation, as the young lady in the first row suggested, is because there were kind of visibly, clearly identifiable Jewish outwardly, wearing whatever they happen to be wearing, pious to tzitzit, to various kinds of headgears, all things we're familiar with. But there's also possibilities because they tend to live in more Jewish enclaves, right, more Jewish, clearly delineated Jewish areas. Also, it's possible they feel more likely to report these things because Jewishness is more important to them. A variety of possibilities. But in any event, clear pattern that Orthodox Jews. I will tell you also that women tend to report several of these things a little more than men. But the biggest difference is statistically between Orthodox and everybody else. It's bigger than differences by age, bigger than differences by region, and so on. We also asked some questions about anti-Semitic tropes, and we distinguished in the survey between things you might have heard some reported, seen on the TV news, or read about in a newspaper. We did ask about that so that people would report that if they wanted to, but we carefully said, no, look, now we want to ask about things you personally have heard firsthand. And so that's what I'm showing here. The shares who say they've heard in their presence someone say something along the lines of Jews care too much about money. And then the shares who say they've heard or read about this secondhand in the past year. And have they heard in their presence or read about or heard secondhand someone saying the Holocaust didn't happen, or it's exaggerated, etc. Or the loyalty, the accusation that Jews care more about Israel than the United States. And in all of these cases, of course, people are saying much more likely to have heard or read about this secondhand, but you get pretty considerable numbers who say they've experienced this in their presence in the past year. And on these numbers, Orthodox Jews overall don't stand out. So ordinary Jews, let's say non-Orthodox Jews, are hearing these tropes as much as Orthodox Jews are. So this is the share who say they personally heard at least one of these in the past year. And again, these are people's perceptions and reported. So I personally, when I look at these data, I don't focus so much on saying, this is the reality, this is the exact share that experience these things. As I look at the internal differences in the data and try to suss out the patterns. Again, the patterns on the previous one, like physical things, Orthodox Jews stand out as experiencing more. When it comes to the tropes, the anti-Semitic stereotype statements, those are about evenly distributed across the various types of Jews. Does that help answer your question? Now, this is another question that we have asked Jews, but we've also asked this of the general public, of everybody. And we've done this repeatedly in polls. The question goes like this. Please tell us how much discrimination there is against each of these groups in our society today. And then we give them, we say first, how much is there against Catholics? How much is there against Black people? How much is there against gays and lesbians? How much discrimination is there against Hispanics? How much discrimination is there against women? And so on. We can put aspects, and we include Jews in that list. By the way, of course, we randomize the order in which we ask these things. I'm not going to get into all the methodological details, but a general pattern that we'll see across pretty much all the groups is that members of each group are more likely to say there's a lot of discrimination against that group than the general public is. So if we look at the share, for example, of U.S. Jews who say there's a lot of discrimination against U.S. Jews, 43%, 4 in 10 American Jews tell us there's a lot of discrimination against Jews. 18% of Americans overall say there's a lot of discrimination against Jews. So Jews are more. Now, but here's an interesting pattern. If we look at Jews and Jewish attitudes and compare them with U.S. adults, we see some interesting things. This is data I just showed you. 43% of Jews think there's a lot of discrimination against Jews compared to 18% of U.S. adults overall. Then we look at what share of Jews and U.S. adults think there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims. And interestingly, more Jews than U.S. adults overall think there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims. And Jews are more likely than the U.S. population overall to say there's a lot of discrimination against blacks. And Jews are more likely than the U.S. a little bit. Maybe, I'm not sure whether this, I'd have to look at this, whether that difference is statistically significant. But maybe a few more or equal numbers. Yes. And more Jews say there's a lot of discrimination against Hispanics than the U.S. population. The only one that we asked about where it's different is Jews are less likely than the general public to say there's a lot of discrimination against evangelical Christians. But note that there are 25% of the U.S. public is evangelical Christians. So just evangelical Christians saying there's a lot of discrimination against evangelical Christians is going to result in a bigger number there. So the general pattern is one in which Jews, now, look, you know a lot of Jews tend to be a liberal group politically, but also Jews are sensitive to discrimination. And so, with that sensitivity, Jews are down. The other thing that's kind of interesting I want to point out is that Jews are not saying effectively here, we're the most discriminated against group. Jews perceive more Jews perceive a lot of discrimination in American society against Muslims than against Jews as of 2020. More Jews perceive a lot of discrimination in American society against blacks. As many Jews perceive a lot of discrimination against gays and lesbians against Jews. And as many Jews perceive a lot of discrimination against Hispanics. Jews are not so sure that there's a lot of discrimination against evangelical Christians. Does this help put also in perspective and help you think back about that answer? Like, how could, at one and the same time, it be the case that the American public overall has favorable views to Jews, yet there's still a lot of anti-Semitism? Both things can kind of potentially be true. And what Jews are sort of saying here is, yeah, I think there's a lot of discrimination against Jews, but I also think there's a lot of discrimination against other groups. So anyway, you all are intelligent people. I'm not, again, I just say this again and again. I'm not here to persuade you that anti-Semitism is a huge rising problem, or that it's not a problem. Anything in between, you make up your own views on that, what you think. I'm trying to share some numbers and some perspectives, and I hope some of this is new to you. Because if I'm just giving you the same old things you already knew, then I'm not really doing a job. What do we know about Jews' views on other Jews? And then secondly, how does this sort out with Jewish political views? So first of all, we don't know a whole lot about Jews' views on other Jews. That's a difficult question to ask as well, a very sensitive question. One thing we did do in this survey is we asked Jews how much they feel they have in common with other kinds of Jews. And I don't have a slide on that, but it is, to me, a very interesting finding. What we find is that a sizable share, about 4 in 10, Reform Jews in the United States say they have little or nothing in common with Orthodox Jews. And about 4 in 10 Orthodox Jews say they have little or nothing in common with Reform Jews. And the share who say they have a lot in common is in both camps is small. And you see more expressed commonality of Reform Jews toward conservative Jews toward Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews toward conservative Jews toward Orthodox Jews. But you do see this sort of bifurcation in which if we think about put Jews on a spectrum of traditionalism or of levels of observance, the polar ends are not seeing much in common. That is exactly the same pattern that we see in surveys in Israel as well, where the Haredim and the Hilonim, or secular Jews, express very negative views actually of each other. And one of the, we don't look for sensational results, but one of the sort of viral results of the findings of our survey in Israel in 2015 was that, if I remember this correctly, I think I'm getting this right exactly, but more Hilonim said they would be very upset if a child of theirs were ever to marry a Haredi Jew, then said they'd be very upset if their child married a Christian in Israel. So that gives you, we didn't ask, like, how favorable are your views, or do you think, how much discrimination do you think there is necessarily, but there are some signs of some tensions or divergences, and those indeed may be political. As you know, Jews as a whole in the United States lean Democratic. Furthermore, contrary to what you might have heard or read, there really isn't evidence that that's shifting. The overall share of Jews who vote Democratic varies from election to election, but it's pretty consistently a solid majority. It's almost never less than 60 and never more than 75. It's in that range, and depends. And some candidates will pull more people overall to the Democratic side, and some will pull more to the Republican side. So an Obama election is different from a George W. Bush election, but going back through many elections, the share of Jews overall and through many polling, not just elections, but just partisan identification, Jews are solidly Democratic and not discernibly moving into the Republican camp as a whole. But Orthodox Jews are solidly Republican and have been becoming more solidly Republican over time. So in 2013, in our survey, 57% of Orthodox Jews were Republican or leaned Republican, as of 2020, 75%.
So does that inform like the view of like the Democrats tend to see?
No. Actually, these attitudes toward discrimination, surprisingly perhaps, are not hugely politically polarized. There are some differences, particularly about certain types of groups. So you'll get different attitudes on Muslims for sure than you will on evangelical Christians. But the attitudes towards Jews tend not to be highly affected by political partisanship. Again, you can slice and dice polling results by a whole lot of things, and if you have a very large sample, as we do in these surveys, you're going to find statistically significant but small differences. But in proportional terms, politics is not a big factor here, and nor is age, by the way. Though age is interesting, and here I'm going to just show that a little bit. Now, let me be clear. Attitudes toward Israel are not the same thing as anti-Semitism necessarily. Pew Research Center doesn't have a stake in this fight over what's anti-Semitism and what isn't. I'm not here to say this statement is anti-Semitic, that one isn't, etc. Let's just all agree. You could be critical of Israel, many Jews are, and not be anti-Semitic. You could be critical of Israel and anti-Semitic. So now I'm just going to show you attitudes toward Israel in the U.S. public. Even though this is a lecture on anti-Semitism, I just want to be clear, I'm not saying negative attitudes toward Israel are per se always clearly necessarily anti-Semitic. They might be, they might not be. It depends. It's complicated. And your opinions are as good as mine on that. I'm not here to do that. We've done surveys asking a variety of types of questions about attitudes toward Israel, attitudes toward Palestinians, attitudes toward the Israeli government, etc., attitudes toward Palestinian people, toward Israeli people here, etc. I just want to show you two polls, 2019, 2020, similar polls, American Trends panel, same group, about 11,000 people total, 10,000, 11,000. Looking at attitudes toward the Israeli people as a whole and the Palestinian people as a whole. Overall, U.S. adults in 2019, 20% said their attitudes were very favorable toward the Israeli people, and 44% said their attitudes were somewhat favorable. In 2022, overall, 20% of Americans said their attitudes were very favorable, and 47% said somewhat favorable. So not much discernible change. For the Palestinian people, in 2019, 7% very favorable, 39% somewhat favorable. In 2022, can you all see over there? 9% very favorable, 43% somewhat favorable. Maybe a little bit of a shift in favorability toward Palestinians altogether. This may be statistically significant, but it's not big in public opinion terms. Of course, it's only 3 years difference, etc. But I'm not seeing a lot there. Okay? Now, what do I see? What really matters? Again, thinking about polling, trying to understand and think about polling in a smart way. It's not only some marginal results. It's the underlying patterns that you see and how consistent they are. And the underlying pattern here is really consistent and big, is that older adults in the United States are twice as likely as adults under the age of 30, that is ages 18 to 29, to say their attitudes toward the Israeli people are very favorable. Twice. And when you put in the somewhats, it's not so big, but very favorable, twice as many. And that pattern is still the same in 2022. The older adults are much more favorable than the young adults. Now, for the Palestinian people, just the reverse. The younger adults are more favorable, twice as likely, approximately, to say their attitudes are very favorable for the Palestinian people, both in 2020, 2019, and in 2022. So overall, I'm not seeing or not claiming to you that there's been, at least between these two polls, a big shift in U.S. public opinion toward Israel. But what I do see is a consistent pattern by age in which younger U.S. adults are less favorable to Israel than older adults. Not necessarily that they were in the past, but than older adults. And just the reverse in terms of attitudes overall toward Palestinians. Now, this is just 2 polls and Pew Research Center polls, but I'm pretty familiar with the polling literature on this, and these patterns are seen again and again and again in polling. Maybe different numbers, but the thing that will jump out if you look at U.S. public opinion toward Israel, or that I encourage you to look at and interrogate when you see polling toward Israel, is the differences between younger Americans and older Americans. Now you're going to ask me why, and why. There's a lot of possibilities, and I would just be speculating. It would just be my opinion, and I'm not here just to give you my opinions. I'm trying to share data, trying to share it as kind of openly as I can, acknowledging its limitations, and leaving to your strong gut sense and your intelligence to interrogate it and figure out, does that mean young people are the future? Does that mean U.S. public opinion is going to shift? I don't know. I'm not here to predict the future. The questions, to summarize sort of very quickly, were, what do we see among Black Americans? Can we look separately? And what do we see among college students or on campuses, and maybe also campus faculty? So, really the best work on this has not been done at Pew Research Center. It's been done by Eitan Hirsch at Tufts. And he's uses surveys. His stuff is published. You can find it on, maybe the easiest way would just be Google Scholar, Eitan Hirsch. Basically, it's a consistent pattern in his papers and in the literature that he cites as well, that there are higher levels of expressed anti-Semitism, not on a feeling thermometer and not on favorabilities, but on the stereotype questions among Black Americans, somewhat more among Hispanic Americans, so people of color generally, you might say, especially Black Americans, than in the general public. He also, though, argues, and he looks at both what you might think of as anti-Semitism from the left, as well as anti-Semitism from the right. So the right would be the alt-right, people who are fascist, neo-Nazi, who have traditional sorts of stereotypes about Jews having too much power, too much money, et cetera, and the left would be and Holocaust denial, that kind of stuff. On the left, there's much less of the Holocaust denial and less of sort of Jews have too much money and power, but a lot of attitudes that are connected to Israel and Zionism and that sort of thing. And he contends that there is still much more anti-Semitism on the right than on the left. But he does find elevated levels among African Americans. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is that anti-Semitism is also higher among people with lower levels of education. And so one of the things that you need to bear in mind is you need to consider what are your controls in these studies. And are you fully controlling your education, as well as age? And I do trust that Egon Hirsch is very good on these things, and he's reporting the results after controls. So even after controlling for a variety of things, there are elevated levels in the African American community he finds. We would find in our data, it's a little bit tricky. The sample sizes aren't really large once you get down to subgroups, and I'm a little reluctant but I would say that that's consistent with what I can see in our data, but without all the controls and all these studies were designed specifically to look at this question. Okay, now campuses. That is really tough. We've been talking about this internally for years, but it's really hard to do a survey of college students. Gallup tried it a few years ago, and they started off by approaching a random sample of 333 U.S. universities asking for permission to survey their students. And guess how many universities gave them permission? Not quite, but 25. And then they got really low response rates, etc. And I'm not going to say that their data were good, but it was really hard. And it took them a long time on permissions. So the whole game now in campus studies, most of what you'll see reported is something called Campus Pulse. And it is an organization that provides data to whoever wants to buy it, including marketers, etc. And it's an opt-in panel, effectively. It's something like 650,000 college students who said, yeah, sure, I'll take a survey for it. And they weren't randomly selected in any way. They are people who opted in. And the trick with opt-in stuff is then the way opt-in isn't inherently junk, but if you can't weight it, because the people who opt in are clearly not going to look like the overall population, right? So, and the problem is we don't have the parameters to weight the college. We don't have any golden data on what share of college students are Jewish, what share are this, what share are that, what's their political views, what etc. We just don't have that nationally to use that for the weighting. So I would tell you to have a gimlet eye toward the polling that can be done quickly and inexpensively with college students using the opt-in data. Those data do show, because I've seen the surveys that come out, AEL has done one together, I think, with Hillel, and they had a survey that they did through College Pulse of Jewish students before October 7th, and they did one after. And they find rising levels of concern about anti-Semitism rising, which to me is not unexpected. But now, what are the effects of the war? I don't know. And I'm not here to speculate. That's not my job. Could move public opinion? Might not. Could move public opinion in Israel? Might not. Could move it in ways that you might not expect. Could move it in different ways over time than initially. The surveys in Israel were initially showing, right after October 7th, strong majority favoring military operation in Gaza. As time went on, this proportion of Israelis in Israeli polls favoring military operation began to fall. So Israeli public opinion is still moving on this question. So those gaps in Israel, the gaps between Hiranim and Haredim, they are across lots and lots of topics. So that's a thing in Israeli surveys. So in the United States, when you look at survey data in general, the thing that as a sociologist or political scientist looking at polling data, the thing that you always have to pay attention to is race. Race just jumps out in U.S. polls, even on things you wouldn't necessarily think. You always have to pay attention to it. Of course, political partisanship too. Right? In Israel, in the Israeli Jewish population, these differences, Hiranim, Haredim, they jump out again and again and again on all kinds of questions, and they're huge. They're bigger than the differences by age. They're bigger than the differences by gender. They're bigger than the differences by education and so on. They really stand out. They really pop in Israeli and have for years. I wouldn't see any reason for that to continue. If you're asking me, is it going to shrink or get larger or whatever, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not here to predict the future. I'm not a pundit. I'm not a commentator. I'm not here to tell you what the woman who stood up said, criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. People don't like Israel. They're anti-Semitic. I'm not denying that. I'm not affirming that. It's not my role. That's for your judgments. I'm going to jump ahead some slides, and I'm going to share with you something I think is really interesting. It's a bit academic, a bit wonky, but I hope you'll appreciate it. I'm going to flip now outside of the United States and look at anti-Semitism worldwide and what we know about it. And this isn't recent data. It's not like October 7th. Long sort of patterns in anti-Semitism worldwide. And I'm going to skip over the European stuff and the patterns that you might expect. A bunch of these things. Just get to a grand theory. Okay? Now, I'm not going to claim credit for this. This is my theory. There's a guy named Daniel Stajetsky. He's a friend of mine. He's a very good statistical analyst in London at the Institute for Jewish Policy Studies in London, and he's a demographer. And he has taken. Someone said earlier that Pew has done surveys in more than 100 countries, 150 languages. We've done that for years and years and years, and in many of those countries, over time, we've asked questions about attitudes toward Jews. The favorability question: how favorable is your opinion of Jews? And what Daniel did was he took all that data from many years and many countries and smushed it all together. So this is data from 2004 to 2016. We don't do every country every year, right? And he put it all on a graph. You can't, it's too small for you to see, but the green represents countries that are predominantly Islamic. So Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Palestinian territories, Morocco, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey. Some of those countries, nearing 100% of the population expressing unfavorable attitudes towards Jews. The yellow is Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, Greece. The brown is Africa. The pink is Eastern Europe. The gray is Latin America. India, China, South Korea, Japan. Sorry, that's China, Japan, South Korea, India are the sort of gray or slashed out. And Western Europe is in blue. So you can see the patterns pretty clearly, straightforwardly. Expressed anti-Semitism, again, I don't know what people think inside, but what they're willing to express. You get some gigantically high levels in Islamic countries. I don't know, somewhere in the middle, at least of this spectrum. I'm not going to characterize it as high or low, but middle in African and a few Asian countries, and one or two Southern European countries, and then the lowest levels in Western Europe. I suspect that doesn't really surprise you. right? Probably not. Now, here comes the grand theory thing. So, what is modernity? What is modernization? It's not just a matter purely of economic development, right? It's not just how rich a country is. There's a variety of things going on. And political scientists have come up with a lot of theories and a lot of ways of looking at this. But one that's had a fair amount of resonance in the academic world over a long period of time is the Engelhardt, and so it's Engelhardt and Weltell. Engelhardt is deceased. He did a lot of survey data, was responsible, one of the founders of the World Value Survey, not Pew data, but done a lot of global survey work. And basically, their argument, which I'm not endorsing, I'm just trying to present to you, and I'm trying to do it in a nutshell, is that there are two main dimensions of what modernity means across countries and societies. One of those dimensions is a kind of traditionality spectrum, and that as countries become more modern, the role of religion and tradition and classical authority, including parental authority, tends to decline. And people tend to see more values in science and individual choice, group choice, negotiation, bureaucracy, whatever. But they move away from sort of traditional authority. That's on that kind of traditionalism. The other argument is that there's a movement on a survivalism axis, and people tend to be less concerned, partly because they don't have to be as concerned about survival, about well-being, about material things, and they tend to begin to value more freedom of opinion, freedom of lifestyle choice, individual quality of life. You can disagree with this. I won't be hurt. I'm just trying to present the theory as best I can. And so, this will look kind of funny to you. It won't look like a normal map of the world. But if you take World Values Survey data, where they ask about these sorts of values questions, and then you put countries on these two axes, the survivalism axis on which you might think of the horizontal axis, and the traditionalism on the vertical axis, and when you see where parts of the world are, you get a picture that I think is going to intuitively make sense to you. I hope it will sort of conform to your sense of where the food is really great, and the hotels are good, and life is modern in various ways, and the places where it's still not modern. Life and modern attitudes. So I think there's something maybe intuitive about this. So when you do that, Protestant Europe, as it got it, is sort of at the highest levels, relatively speaking, of both the secular rational values, the lowest levels of traditional values, and highest levels of self-expression, lowest levels of survivalism, so Protestant Europe. So this is Sweden up here in the far right corner, sort of the most modern country. And Denmark and Norway and Germany, Switzerland and Finland, Iceland are all up there. And then a little bit lower, very self-expressionist, a little lower, a little more traditional values, English-speaking world, Australia, whatever. And see where the U.S. is kind of an interesting place where we're high in the sort of self-expression values, and so materialism. So we're not so materialistic. People have pretty good standard of life, not so worried about survival, but pretty traditional in our values, relatively speaking. And then this is so that's, can you see this? Protestant Europe, English-speaking Western world, Catholic Europe, sort of here in the middle. And then, so Asia is then, again, in this sort of map of the world, over here in the upper left corner. So, actually pretty survivalist. I mean, life isn't that great, but they're pretty high on secular rational values, pretty low on traditional values. I won't go through the whole map. Can you see the Orthodox? This is Central and Eastern Europe. South Asia is here. Latin America is down in the middle, but very traditional values and sort of in the middle. on the survivalism, kind of materialism index. The Islamic world, or the Islamic countries, I'm not really fond of the term Islamic world because it's quite a variegated situation in these different places, but the Islamic countries and sub-Saharan Africa are down in the lower left corner with quite traditional values and quite survivalist oriented. Okay? All right, so why am I going through all this? Who cares? All this academic tone. Because it's really interesting when Stajetsky takes those things, those values, and uses them to try to predict levels of anti-Semitism, levels of negative attitudes towards Jews, which do correlate with these values. And what you have here, this big graph here, is in his statistical model how much negative attitudes there would be against Jews in all those countries, just based, predicted on where they are on that index of modernity. And this in the inset is the observed levels. And it's really interesting because, as I think your eye can see, the predicted and the observed, well, they're not identical, but they're pretty close. I mean, the predicted is a pretty good prediction. Let me just note a few things about it. The observed levels in Islamic countries, if you can see, this is 100%. So a lot of these are at 90% or above. Here they're at 80% or above. So actually, the observed levels of anti-Semitism in the Islamic world, or in these Islamic countries, are higher than would be predicted in his model. In other words, some exogenous factor, like politics, like the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli, or whatever, Israel, etc., those things may be elevating anti-Semitism even more than it would naturally be just under his model. This is essentially what he's sort of saying is here's where it would naturally be, just as a matter of quality of life and overall attitudes in these countries, and here's where it actually is. And interestingly, the observed levels in Western Europe and the United States are less, they're lower than where you would predict them to be. And the attitudes in Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, and in the Islamic countries, and in some parts of Africa, are higher than you would predict. Is that interesting? I think it's pretty interesting. Again, I'm going to state for the third or fourth time, I'm not endorsing the theory that there's lots of theories of modernity and all that, but I think there's something here to think about. Nigeria. Nigeria's population, by the way, is almost equally, it's like half Muslim, half Christian. And Nigeria hasn't released census data on religion in a lot of years, so nobody actually knows what the percentage is, but it's very close to half and half. And there's a lot of, all the way down to Spain. Spain and Greece have, in our people, a lot of negative attitudes toward minorities in general. There's quite a lot of, it's complicated reasons, etc. And I'm not trying to name or shame any particular countries. That's also not my goal here. I just think that if you ask yourself, and again, I said at the beginning, you may not want to think about like what predicts anti-Semitism. Why is there anti-Semitism? It's irrational. Let's not even. It's like trying to justify or understand terrorism or something. Like even to think about why it exists is somehow abhorrent, right? It's just wrong. It shouldn't be there. It's like racism. We don't want to think about why is there racism. It's racism. It's wrong. It shouldn't be there. But if you're willing to like set aside your feelings for a moment and try to think about these things like a social scientist, the interesting point is that modernity itself is pretty predictive of where a lot of the world is in terms of anti-Semitism. Again, it's also not my role to tell you what should be done about it, but in a sense, another thing that this could be saying to you is that as countries modernize and their values change and move to be more modern values, again, under somebody else's definition, I'm not trying to attach a normative thing to it, I'm not trying to say Sweden's a better place than Greece, but if you buy that, then the notion is that as countries move on that map, this is where they're less anti-Semitic. They're much less anti-Semitic up here, and they're much more anti-Semitic down here. And so maybe that's a hopeful thought that I would leave you with. The hopeful thought that, again, it's hard to say. I don't have a view that all of history is a steady progression toward better, right? It's not tout est au mieux dans le meilleur des pays possible or anything like that. It's not that everything is always going to be better, but maybe there's hope that as the world modernizes, anti-Semitism might fall away almost naturally as values change.